Just a quick announcement at the beginning of this video. We will now be doing the End of Times one night a week on Wednesday nights. Normally we do it on Wednesdays and Saturdays, but we're only going to be doing it on Wednesday nights moving forward. We are going to be making these videos significantly longer to still get through the same amount of content, but with one video a week instead of two. Welcome to a series that we call the End of Times, where we're going through the book of Revelation verse by verse to try our best to see what it is we can expect to happen in the end times, or the times Jesus refers to as the end of the age. And where we are in this book is we've kind of gotten to the end of what takes place right before Jesus Christ returns. In chapter 11, and the story just kind of stops there. We're at the seventh trumpet. The seventh trumpet has been blasted. There's been some kingdom on heaven has been declared on earth as well. And then there's just this stop in the story, and John sees a sign in heaven, and there's a whole other story that's about to take place. So it's really important that we kind of talk about, well, what got us here, and then we're going to talk about that story. Now, first and foremost, what we have seen from the throne room of God, because John has seen this from the throne room of God, and he is invited to come and see. And what we see is God has a scroll, and it has 7 seals. And it is determined that only Jesus Christ, the wounded, bloody Jesus Christ, is worthy to open that scroll, because it's about the coming, it's about the redemption of mankind and the coming of his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And as those 7 seals are broken, what we see is events take place caused by the evil hearts of men, but manipulated spiritually by horsemen. Kings are determined, wars are played out. There's famine, pestilence, death, again, all caused by the evil hearts of men. And then there is a heavy persecution of Christians. I believe it's at that point that we see, it's around the 5th seal, that we see then the abomination. Now there's a lot of things that are determined at that, but abomination, the abomination of desolation, where the temple is, there's an abomination in the temple, most likely the antichrist declaring himself to be God there. There's a heavy persecution of Christians, both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Then we see a multitude of Christians slain. And then finally, after that 7th seal is broken, then we see the wrath of God. So we're kind of near the end of this 3.5 years that was promised by Daniel. It was also spoken about in Revelation, that once that abomination takes place, you got 3.5 years of tribulation, which tribulation means just persecution of Christians. You're going through a tribulation. You're declaring Jesus in the face of adversity, of somebody trying to kill you for declaring him to be God, whenever the Antichrist is declaring himself to be God. And it's a war. It's a war between the Christians and the world of the Antichrist. And it's near the end that finally the wrath of God comes in the form of 7 trumpets. And those 7 trumpets, we see the destruction of Babylon. The first, second, third, and fourth trumpet destroys 1/3 of the earth. And we'll talk about what Babylon is later when we get to that chapter, but destroys Babylon. Then the bottomless pit is opened up, and smoke comes out and covers the entire planet, so the entire planet is dark. Then there's spiritual beings that then sting people who are not marked of God, so we know that they're spiritual things. They're not things of the earth. They only harm people that aren't Christians. And then there's this killing by spiritual beings of 1/3 of mankind. And then finally, we see the rapture of the church take place, and then it is at that point that we are at now. The 7th trumpet is blasted, Christ is returning, and then there's this pause. And there's a very important story that's about to take place in chapter 12. Now, what's taking place here, we're going to spend a lot of time on just chapter 12, because he sees a sign in heaven. Like, suddenly this story stops and John sees a sign in heaven. And what we're about to see is really the history of the world from the beginning all the way to the end in this really interesting story. So we're just going to pick it up in chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her capital C child, as soon as it was born. And she bore a male child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Now, that's kind of the history of the world in a spiritual realm, because what we're seeing here is we're seeing the nation of Israel come about. And then from that nation of Israel, the woman is Israel, and we'll get into how we know that here in a second. The woman is Israel, and from her comes a child, Jesus Christ. The Jews, or the nation of Israel, are not necessarily special, like they have any superpowers. They're God's chosen people, and it's not because they're any better than anybody else. They're God's chosen people because of a decision Abraham made at the very beginning, that he would be willing to sacrifice his own son if God asked him to. And then God then said, from you is this seed. And it is from Abraham that then came a nation of Israel. And then from Israel, and the reason they're the chosen people is because they were going to be the lineage of Jesus Christ. So let's kind of go back to 12:1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the nation of Israel. We're looking at the nation of Israel, and then we're looking at Jesus Christ bearing from them. And then we're also looking at Satan. Satan is the dragon, and later in 12 we'll get into that. But Satan is the dragon, and he is there to stop that, because he is the ruler of the earth. He is the prince of the earth. He didn't want this guy to rule. He didn't want Jesus to rule. He declared himself to be God. He wants to sit on the throne of God and rule over the nation. So he has always been ready to devour anything that came from the nation of Israel. Well, Jesus Christ came from the nation of Israel. So now he's ready to devour anything that came from Jesus Christ, which is Christianity. So he's ready to devour that. He's patiently waiting to devour it. And then what takes place is then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And then I want to remind you that that exact same number was the same number that we were given of the 2 witnesses, the Jews and the Gentiles, to preach the gospel. The 144,000 marked by God Jews, who were the Antichrist and the devil are warring against, and the multitude of Christians that the Antichrist and the devil are warring against, they had 1,260 days to prophesy, and God was going to protect them and allow them to be able to reveal that He is Lord. From the moment of the abomination, for 1,260 days, they have this ability to withstand this assault from the most powerful army of the world army of the Antichrist. But yet they war against him, and they do okay because they were given this promise at the end. So we're really seeing a lot here. So let's kind of just break this down piece by piece. I kind of just laid a lot out there. That's a lot. But let's break it down piece by piece. Let's look at verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Okay, it's widely believed that they're referring to the nation of Israel. Well, Jesus Christ came from the nation of Israel, so we know that this is most likely the case. But if we go to Genesis chapter 37, what we're looking at here in Genesis 37 is Jacob, who was named Israel. That's where he is a descendant of Abraham, but he is the literal father of Israel. His name is Israel. God named him Israel, and he had 12 sons, and that was the 12 tribes of Israel, were the 12 sons of Israel, or of Jacob. And one of them was Joseph, and we've heard of the story of Joseph. He was beloved by his father Jacob, and we're just going to pick it up right there. Chapter 37, verse 3. Now Israel loved Jacob more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, he hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dream and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, Look, I've dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me." So we're going to pause there real quick. Okay, so his second dream. So Joseph is one of the 12 brothers. Now he did eventually rule over them as the leader of Egypt for a while when they had a famine, and they had a much longer story. But ultimately, the 12 tribes all united, the 12 tribes of Israel, Moses led them free, and there were 12 of them, and they were here referred to as the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So there was 11 stars. He was one of the stars. So now let's go back to Revelation 12, verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head a garland of 12 stars. It's really the same thing. I mean, I think there's no other correlation. I'm only using the Bible as a reference, so there's no other, it's a pretty direct reference. I think it's pretty easy to kind of buy that's what that is. This is the nation of Israel. And then it is promised that from Israel will come a child, the only begotten Son of God. Verse 2, then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And Israel is always being persecuted, always. I mean, they went through a lot of pain, being led off into captivity by Babylon, being then ruled by the Persians, then ruled by the Greeks, then ruled by the Romans. I mean, they went through a lot of problems and a lot of pains giving birth to Jesus. And all of that we see as history, but it was really the devil trying to stop this woman from giving birth, trying to stop Israel from bringing about the only begotten Son. And how do you do that? You destroy Israel. Israel is constantly in a state of war, and are to this day. Verse 3, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. We'll talk about that next time. But that is Satan. And his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. And that's a capital C, child. So as soon as Jesus was born, he was ready to be devoured. He was going to be devoured. They had to flee. Mary and Joseph had to leave and flee because the king was going to kill Jesus. Like, he was ready to, as soon as he was born from this nation of Israel, it has always been set to kill him. But of course, Jesus came to die. Like, that's why he came, but he had a mission. He had to prove himself to be God first. That way he could show himself to be God, lay down his life for you because he loves you that much, and then rise from the dead 3 days later to show, I am God, and now you are redeemed of your past, present, future sins by the blood of Jesus. And now Satan is ready to kill that thing because he couldn't kill the first thing. He couldn't kill Jesus. I mean, he killed him, but he lived. He rose from the dead because he's God. And then his blood redeemed you, and it will redeem me. And Satan's been trying to destroy that the whole time. And now he's going to do it in the form of the antichrist. And he's going to then persecute and kill Christians in a heavy tribulation that will go on for about 3.5 years. Now, this is an important story for many reasons. Number one, people for some reason, there's this pre-tribulation rapture, people don't see themselves going through tribulation But what we're seeing in Revelation, throughout Revelation, is just heavy persecutions of Christians. I mean, you know, whether or not you believe the witnesses are two prophets, or whether you believe they're the Jews and the Gentile Christians, either way, there's a heavy persecution of Christians. The fifth seal is broken, chapter 6, 9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who have been slain for the word of the God and for the testimony which they held. Chapter 7, verse 14, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. You know, it's a heavy person. That's what tribulation stands for. But God is going to protect us for 1,260 days. Now, not all of us, because obviously heavy persecution of Christians, a lot of death to Christians, a lot of Christians are being killed. But as it also says during that killing of the Christians in the fifth seal being broken, chapter 6, when they ask, well, how long is this going to go on? To God, he says, they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. So there's this constant preaching of the word of God from the abomination. The moment that the Antichrist sits in the temple and says, I'm God, you know, then boom, now Christians are being persecuted. Christians are saying, no, you're not. Well, a lot of Christians will say he is. A lot of Christians will say he is, because a lot of people declare themselves to be Christians and they're not. They'll go, oh, look, it's God. He's in the temple, just like Jesus said in Matthew 24 they will do. But people who know who Jesus Christ is and know that that's not how he comes to this earth, he comes like a flash of lightning from the clouds. That's not how he comes. He doesn't sit in the temple and declare himself to be God and then start killing Christians. That's what the devil does. It's the antichrist. He's doing the opposite of what Jesus is doing. He's going to be killing Christians. And for 1,260 days, God is going to protect them and give them this place in the wilderness, because again, this woman, Israel, gives birth to a child. That child then gets killed, gives birth to Christians. And now, so you really kind of have all of salvation in chapter 12, 1 through 6. But the story doesn't end there. We're going to be introduced to who the dragon is in great detail. And then we're going to, from verses 13 through 17, chapter 12, we're going to see a little closer what that persecution looks like. But we're going to talk about who the dragon is, having the 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his head. What is that? But roughly what you have going on here is you have, the 7 years of or the 3.5 years of tribulation has happened. The trumpet is blasted, and then there's this pause, and John sees a sign in heaven, and a great sign in heaven, and it is the nation of Israel giving birth to Jesus Christ, which then gives birth to Christians, because those who are redeemed by the blood of Christ. And we know that is this last persecuted group, because if we jump to 17, it says, and the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandment of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So, again, that's kind of what you got going on here. He's seeing like a sign in heaven. It's a sign. He sees this woman. He sees ultimately the nation of Israel gives birth to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ gives rebirth to the redemption of mankind, to the Jews and the Gentiles. And then Satan's just trying to devour that the whole time. And then we finally get to the end where he's running out of time. He's running out of time. He has one last shot at this to devour the offspring of Jesus Christ. And that's me, that's you. It's really kind of a beautiful story, but it's in a weird way, the history of the world in 6 verses. So we'll kind of pick up on this. We're not leaving it. We're going to go to verse 3 next time. So we'll keep talking about verses 1 through 6 for at least 1 or 2 more episodes. And then we'll kind of get deeper into, well, who is the dragon exactly? And then kind of how's this story end. And then we're going to be introduced to the beasts of the sea. Good stuff coming. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Put it in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel to Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God.